I just wanted to thank U of O, Dr. Lewis, Professor Ratcliffe for bringing me here, and also, U of O is really rolling out the red carpet, and it's super fun to be here. And to illustrate this point, this is what was happening in DC. It was a small protest, but that was President's Day weekend, not my president, and now we're here, and I'm a runner, and I'm so happy to be in a change of scenery. So thank you guys for giving me this opportunity. So I want to step back because I think that journalism has been a little too excited about the promise of data journalism, which I call interactive journalism, and I'll explain in a second why. But I think there's been sort of a master narrative that has been talked about that I think just needs to be exploded. And I think I use the word master narrative for two reasons. The first is that interactive journalists are sort of talked about as masters of the universe, sort of these magical unicorns who will come in and save journalism, but also the idea of mastery in terms of adding quantification and making journalism more scientific, visible, even transparent. And I think that we really need to push back on these assumptions and think about where we go now. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of reflection on that master narrative, talk about how that fits in post-election, and then move on to really doing a nice critique of what this whole phenomena is. I should mention that when I wrote this book, I was totally bullish on the future of interactive journalism, and I've had that shaken a little bit, and you'll see why. So this is sort of a pretty typical beginning of interactive journalism kind of story. This is a New York Magazine story. What are these renegade cyber geeks doing at the New York Times, maybe saving it, right? This is how this dynamic has been phrased. You might recognize this guy who, and he, really was at the forefront, Andrew. But this is still really present. This is from a Wired article last week where Sulzberger is bragging about the fact that the Times has more journalists that can write code than any other news organization, and just how much this was pushing the news organization, because some people were pushing it back against this experimentation, right? So this is, right, how the New York Times is clawing its way into the future. This is the narrative we hear about coding. And there's a real sort of political economy reason, right? There's a real reason that's rooted in structural factors in the news industry. Part of it is that this stuff draws a lot of traffic. So this is the 2014 list of, so what you would, can I just wait for a second? Sorry. No, it's okay. Just take a second. So what I'm about to show you is a list of the top 12, because I should have screenshotted a little better, interactives from the Times in 2014. 6 out of the 12 are interactives. There are also different kinds of interactives, from quizzes to multimedia storytelling to data journalism that we think of. And I think that really illustrates the broad spectrum of what interactive journalism can be. I do think this visual is important. Yeah, it takes a second to recycle. So give it a second. Let me give this a second. And then the next slide I will show you is where that is last year, right, at the end of 2016. And again, 4 out of the top 10 stories in terms of traffic at the New York Times were some form of interactives, right? And that's really important because it shows, right, when news organizations are trying to move beyond click-driven economics and make a case for engagement with readers, people spend time on these, and these are also things that get shared quite a bit. So you can see this is the 2014 top 12 stories. It goes on to 20, but just as a visual, right, that's a lot, right? And then even, right, 2016, again, as a visual, that's a lot, right? When you think about the number of stories that the Times is producing every year, right? And I think some of this is really warranted. in part because of the kinds of storytelling it enables us to do and the way that it brings in new readers. So you guys have probably heard about Snowfall. If you haven't, you need to. This was sort of what set into motion really the big popularization of interactive storytelling. This was a 360 view with embedded videos and maps that you could direct yourself through, but also just a beautiful classic 9,000 word narrative. And it won the Pulitzer that year in 2012. The interesting thing about this is in the sort of peak traffic moments, 1/3 of visitors to Snowfall were people who had never been to NewYorkTimes.com, right? Which is a really big deal. And so I think this shows kind of the promise both in terms of storytelling, but also in terms of the economics of all of this. And I should say one more thing. To snowfall became a verb, not only at the New York Times, but elsewhere. So people would say, I want my story snowfalled, right? And you can't make every story a snowfall. But here, okay, I want to talk about why coding is important beyond data. And it's because of the way that stories get told. So this is my favorite all-time interactive. The BBC did a series on the secret life of cats in broadcast, and then they did a whole interactive side to it. So they actually put GoPros on cats with geo-trackers, and you can follow like 10 cats with different personalities about what they do through the day. That's amazing. That's such cool storytelling, right? And it's not just data, right? Let's not just talk about data. But of course, there is data, right? And the Opportunity Gap is a ProPublica effort that really kind of changed my perspective, because you can do a really personal storytelling, but also get a national picture. So you can actually see how the school next to you, whether they've got school lunches or what's happening in a big city where things might be a little bit more different from where you are. And you see sort of just charts, right? So the first was just database-driven storytelling. This is a dynamic chart where you can enter your zip code. By the way, Andrew Devigal did one of the first interactives in 1995, the Chicago Tribune, that was all hand-coded and monstrous. So he really has been part of this for a long time. There are also news games. News games, this is before you guys, a lot of you guys in the room, but this was an Oregon Trail adapted for getting to the polls, right? This is a game, right? Requires coding. It's a totally different kind of interactive. And of course, there are quizzes. For 2 years in a row, this was in the top 5 of New York Times traffic. I argue that this has news value because it tells you something you didn't know, right, about your world. And this was just a quiz, and it actually got my dialect down to 5 miles from my house, which concerned me because I don't think I sound like that much of a New Yorker. But anyway, right? So all of what this did is it's created, and I think maybe rightly so, a myth of sort of what the hacker journalist can do in a newsroom, right? This magical person who can combine storytelling with programming language. And this is a slide that's the Knight Foundation put out. That's actually based on a real person named Brian Boyer, who came in from outside the field of journalism. And he went to journalism school at Northwestern, and the cool hacker is a guy who is wearing headphones and a t-shirt with code, and then the nerdy reporter is wearing the V-neck sweater and has glasses, and then that somehow transforms into a beard, which I don't really get the calculus, but this is, a data visualizer, a pragmatic, great journalist 2.0. In all of the pictures I've shown you so far, it's all been men. So just put that in the back of your mind. Right, this was sort of the vision. I thought really that this new approach to storytelling, data visualization, interactives was really just sort of pushing our understanding of the world in a way that we were just becoming more informed and more educated. And there was this great potential for traditional journalism to reclaim its authority because it was telling stories that were web-enabled and really just sort of bring people back into the fold to see the value of what journalists could do in a digital age. And, I knew we were polarized. We are, but I wasn't sure really what the implications were. And I think the way that data journalism and interactive journalism got positioned as the salvo of journalistic authority was really dangerous. So here's, Nate Silver's manifesto when he started 538, right? He was the guy that predicted the election correctly in 2008 and 2012, right? One of the potential advantages of data journalism is that it generalizes better than traditional approaches, particularly as data sets increase in scale to become larger and more complex, right? Data journalism clarifies the generalities, right? And that was sort of the perspective, and everybody wanted to do more data journalism and more interactive storytelling. There are serious problems with this, right? I don't know, it depends on your political perspective, how you would have interpreted this at the time, but this is a really slimmed down version of what was happening, right? I had friends in DC who were refreshing the Nowcast before they went to bed at night, and they're like, oh, phew, okay, Nate Silver still says that Hillary Clinton is winning, or maybe they get fired up, less so in DC, about sort of what was happening on the right. But this belies the sophistication and problems in the polling, but also this is a pretty satisfying presentation of the data, which is concerning, right? Okay, this happened. Everyone's like, oh, we're so surprised. This is a Dewey beats Truman moment. The data was bad. And to some extent, that is true, because actually the decline in the news industry meant that fewer local news organizations were doing consistent polls. So statewide polling was probably worse than it's ever been. Nationally, the polling it was about as off as the Romney-Obama election, so consistently off. But it's not like people doing this. If you go back and read the Upshot or Silver, right, they know this. They account for it. These are these extensive meditations on issue with polling data. But that's not something you see here, right? It's a really simplified presentation. You get to engage. You can see percentages, right? That's not what's being narrated. And it's continuing to happen, right? This is I think this is actually the Real Clear Politics map. But this makes Virginia look very comfortably blue, which is not the headline you see in the Post, right? The prose headline is Clinton edges Trump in Virginia. This will probably be the graphic that you see in your Facebook feed, right? And that belies the sophistication, right? And the difficulty of interpretation in that words still matter a lot, right? And quantification doesn't necessarily need to clarity. Okay, so if interactive journalism will not save us, because I don't think it will, I don't think this has done anything to reestablish the authority among people who have not trusted mainstream media. What's next, right? And I think there are a couple of essential questions we have to ask ourselves. So the first is really sort of, how does this master narrative change, right? Both for working professionals, but also for people in sort of education environments. If you're going to make the case, right, so number two, if you're going to make the case for interactive journalism and data journalism, right, what is actually being offered? What is the real value proposition beyond the data and beyond the storytelling? Like, is there another way to make an argument for the relevance? And then what happens now, which I'm a little less clear on. But the first thing I want to establish is, okay, this is a word cloud. Anybody who does data visualization would want to punch me right now. You don't do word clouds because they don't show strength of, anyway. But it makes sense here because I think it shows all of the different terms that we have, right? Are you a data journalist? Are you a data scientist? Are you a maker? Are you a programmer journalist? Are you a car reporter? Like, I don't know what we call ourselves. I don't know what people call themselves. It turns out a lot of things. So one of the big issues is how do we begin to unify all of these disparate skills, all of these disparate forms of storytelling into some sort of uniform conversation so we can begin to have a little bit more self-reflection, but also a bigger case to tell to the larger journalistic community, but also to the public. And so that's why I use the word interactive journalists, because I think you can see from the stories that I showed you before, that this is not just about learning to use data. Some people may be more coding heavy, some people may be more data heavy, some people may be more UX heavy, right? And some people may be narrative storytellers who work with these folks. So I think you really need to think about the step back about what's uniting these fundamental differences. And really, it's just advances in using code to tell stories, right? And making them interactive. And I think that's my argument. And so how I define this is a mouthful, which maybe strategically from a book perspective was not the smartest. But visual presentation of storytelling through code for multi-layered tactile user control for the purpose of news and information. And I try to pack a lot into this, right? So we've talked about the visual presentation of storytelling. We've talked a little bit less about the role of code, but this is really important because you're getting multiple levels of storytelling in a single interface. You largely get to control your experience, right? And this is a new way to think about news and information. So that's why I came up with the definition that I have. And I think it really does speak to the broad facility here. So I've promised we would acknowledge limitations, and let's do that, because I think to really have a real conversation about where journalism is going to go, where journalism education is going to go, how we meet the challenges of dealing with a lot of people who do not trust mainstream media, this is a kind of conversation that we need to have. I think the first acknowledgement is that journalists are not statisticians, but they're doing a lot of statistical work. That's deeply problematic. At some of the best places in the country, you do have people who are really, who might have masters in statistics. You might have data scientists who can do all sorts of cool stuff statistically, but big data statistics are not always what you would use for the kind of, I think journalists actually use small data, right? They're using something with maybe 200,000 rows, whereas people working with big data, you're talking about terabytes of data. So journalists are working with big data in quotes, right? And so the statistical firepower that a data scientist might bring may not actually apply in the data that exists, right? So statistical knowledge is deeply uneven. How many of the students in this room have taken a statistics class? Okay, so really all of you should, right? Right, and it's just, when you think about what journalists have said to me, we just do descriptive statistics. We're not software engineers with math degrees, right? And then there's this critique that making sense of raw data requires more analytic firepower and willingness to do independent research than journalists have really been comfortable with, right? So even people who are doing this stuff are not as numerate as they need to be, right? And there's this amusing situation where it's what I call the blind leading the blind. And if you go into the NICAR listserv, which is where a lot of these professionals talk, you see a lot of how do I do this statistical thing, right? Or how do I do this coding thing also? And this is a piece of advice. This is probably all wrong, but it might help you clarify, right? These are the people who are trying to make a case for authoritative knowledge to the public. That's not what you want, right? And that is a really big limitation. The other thing we don't talk enough about is how data is socially constructed, right? And what I mean by that, and I think Alison Schrager, who's a media writer, really puts this well, even data-backed journalism is opinion journalism, right? Every variable is constructed in a way that decisions have been made about what to leave in and what to leave out. So you think about something really contested as a variable like race, right? It doesn't have the drop downs it needs to, right? And so when you start to use the racial composition for voters, it's already wrong, right? It already oversimplifies, or it already, even if it's right, it's implying a certain judgment that doesn't get talked about. So Derek Willis, former New York Times interactive journalist who's now at ProPublica, has this phrase, interview the data, but he usually means it to be critical about the source you're getting it from, and think about looking at data as a point of inquiry that you would as a reporter. He doesn't get into this idea of the fact that the way that we construct our data sets are sort of at the end kind of qualitative judgments about what to include and what not to include. So I'm going to make fun of Pew for a second because we get all of these really important industry reports from Pew about the state of the news industry and a lot of consumption data. The way they define news is deeply troublesome to me. Their definition of news in all of the studies that they do is news as information about events and issues beyond just friends and family. So is like a tertiary friend who got into a car accident news? Maybe, right? And so this is and this is where we make a lot of industry predictions from. So just to kind of ram home that point a little bit, and I think there's also, another point to think about, which is, as a major point of critique, more information is not necessarily better, right? Just because we know more, it may actually obfuscate, particularly in the way that it's presented. So this was a technical, astounding accomplishment for interactive journalists at newsrooms. This was the live presidential forecast, right? For really one of the first times on a single page that didn't require refreshing, live data was being fed into an interactive, and it was moving. That's hard. That would be hard for Google to do, right? So it is a real accomplishment. I have no idea what this meant. I don't know why it was changing. It was not explained to me why it was changing. I was not alone. Somebody from Gizmodo wrote a blog. I won't repeat the top line, but you can read it for yourselves. It is not exactly clear where this particular percentage is coming from, or even if it's accurate, right? Even just yesterday, the Time Zone election blog gave Hillary an 85% chance of winning. But more important, this pressure gauge with whatever. Okay. So, this was information, but what the heck did it mean, right? And what emotional results does this have? Because information affects us emotionally too, right? The other thing, right, to add on to this, right, because that was a lot of information that theoretically told us something, is that visualizations may not help, right? So this is the lead-in to the graphic I'm about to show you, okay? Right? Over 107,000 votes in 3 states effectively decided the election. This is the interactive. I don't know if that's true because there are these big bubbles. I don't know how that's 107,000 people. I don't understand. But I could play with this and it zoomed in county-wise and it was pretty cool, right? But this is and if you go through, there are so many examples of attempts to visualize data and even tell stories through data that just obscure the thesis that you can read in the headline, right? And that's problematic because you spend more time playing with this than you do reading the headline, right? So to take a step back, what I'm saying is all of the great storytelling in the world, I tried to Trumpify this, may not help with trust. And it may not help with partisans. It may not recover journalistic authority. And I think that's a real conclusion that we need to begin to start talking about. How much has journalistic authority been hurt, and do these efforts to reclaim it really do anything? And moreover, how does some of the news we create actually prompt more critique and more misinformation? So I think it's worth talking about. So let's think for a second, right? Stepping back. Okay, I've just done this massive critique, right? Where do we go from here? What does data journalism offer? What does interactive journalism offer? What should you learn, right? This is the desk of Ben Kroski. He is a programmer, journalist, interactive journalist at the Times. This does not look anything like what a lot of you might be doing, unless you're doing maybe some photo editing, but he's just running lines of code on one side. This is him creating a Fashion Week interactive over the course of a day, which is a pretty extensive, tall ask, right? So I'm going to argue that skills are really not the conversation that we need to be having, right? It's not about, let me just get every skill I can have so I can go into a newsroom and be firepower. I think it's maybe a small part of the equation, and I think actually as this stuff becomes more popular, a lot of the pre-built tools would do a lot of the work. And in fact, some of the best journalists doing interactive work at The Guardian don't know much code. They're just using pre-built tools, right? So skills are not enough. So what's the argument to make? And I think that this really draws on what is most important about bringing in something new into journalism, which is a refreshing of ideas, right? Bringing in new concepts, new ways of thinking into journalism, right? And so programmers, right, startups, right, the world of open source has a lot of really good things to offer in terms of changing journalistic culture. And Dr. Lewis and I have actually written a little bit about this together. But hacking, right? And when you think of hacking, I don't mean anonymous. I mean about hacking as a clever way to solve problems, which is really the way that most hackers, self-identified hackers, would prefer to think about it, right? Thinking about things in ways to make life easier, I think, is a really good lesson to take from the ethos of programming, right? The freedom to fail, right? Journalists don't, one of the tensions I found was that journalists don't like to put out anything that isn't perfect, for all of the reasons we've just discussed. But there is something to making it clear that you're putting out maybe not your final product and being transparent about that. I don't know if that means just doing an interactive that's, you know, an early version and getting it out there because it's newsy, or if that means being really clear about what you don't have with a story. I'm not sure. But this idea of constant iteration is something that a lot of newsrooms really could embrace a bit more. Something I think is really powerful is this idea of maybe a distributed sense of community. One of the things that's so cool about this interactive journalism movement is that they post, most people, if you go to almost every website if you think about almost every major news organization, they have some sort of posting on GitHub, right? They are contributing to the open source repository, or they're at least taking from it, right? And there is a real sense of showing your work and sharing and building on the shoulders of giants that is a profound sense of openness, right, and sharing that is currently not something that permeates journalism. In the book, I argue that code is editorial product because it is what is driving storytelling, and the direction of that code would not come in the way it does if there wasn't editorial thinking behind it. So these people are essentially sharing their storytelling, right? It's just in a different form, and that is not something you see Panama Papers, right? Real big exception to the rule, right? And then I think it's just a fundamental sense of openness and transparency, right? This idea of showing your work, this idea of bringing in a culture that really values the sausage-making process, right? Journalists care about making other organizations transparent, but they do a lot of, they're not so transparent themselves, right? So there are a lot of ways technically that you could show sources better, for example, or explain the process of reporting, or, you know, what we know and what we don't know. That really creates a conversation about, okay, what is the weakness endemic to this story and what's the strength? To give people a better sense of, before they critique you for being biased, right? Why is the story being told the way it is, right? And I think that there's a lot of power to people who come from a culture that is vested in this sensitivity. So we're at sort of 35 minutes, so I can go a little bit more. And what I think I'll do now is talk to you about the values that I think that this form of storytelling is bringing to the newsroom. Because I do think there's sort of a almost coherent sense of like normative values, right? And we're talking, you know, objectivity is a normative value, right? These are sort of values of professional practice that I think are being brought into newsrooms as a result, right? I think sort of thinking more generally, this idea of just making things is something that journalists haven't really talked about, right? Like building, making, crafting, playing, right? That maker culture is something that's becoming part of the journalistic vocabulary, right? So I've got these 5 premises that I discuss in the book. build it journalism, see it for yourself journalism, near far journalism, openness, and same but different narrative nut graphs. I could use a little bit more of a PR help with my terms, so if any of you want to help, that would be great. So build it journalism builds off of what I just talked about in terms of maker culture. Journalists haven't created tools, right? We're talking about databases. We're talking about ways to host documents. We're talking about content management systems. We're talking about software. This has not been something that newsrooms have traditionally done, but now there is a vocabulary of building, right? Building software, building products. And I think it's a really interesting way to think about journalism more generally as a tool that can be used, right? And think about, we're using words like build and tool for like digital things, which I think is a kind of interesting, mouse for not a real mouse, right? So it's a continuation of that. And you can see these words coming through in some of these blogs that get shared, right? So you started building charts. A few months ago, we built. The vision was to build, right? You just see this word over and over again, and I think it's permeating through to news. Some of the products that get built, Document Cloud, right? That is the primary way that a lot of documents are being hosted right now. It's basically a PDF viewer that makes things recognizable, makes it easy to search for the words. There's something called the Panda Project, which is making newsrooms' internal databases a little bit easier. There's Overview Project, which is a way to do text analysis of document dumps. Right? These are all tools that aid journalism that we didn't used to make or create anymore, right? See it for yourself journalism really builds on a culture of the web of investigation on your own terms, right? The whole part of the problem we're having a conversation with is people can go and seek information on their own terms, which if you don't know what you're doing can lead to some pretty bad premises, right? But this is actually on some level good, right? Because you're able to investigate your own questions. And you can do things like, this is one of my favorite, just simple calculators. Where are you on the global fat scale, right? You can go in and check on your own terms and investigate and tell the story for yourself. The way that you can direct your movement through interactives. This was a really cool story that the Times did in terms of there were these two women who influenced blues and jazz culture that have been forgotten about. You control your experience of the story, right? The visualization of data and the presentation of full data sets allows you to decide on your own who's right. So the FT and the Guardian had the same set of data about commuters and told two completely different stories. The Guardian hosted all of that data and said, this is how we made our conclusions, which is a different way to tell that story, right? There's also this idea of near and far, which is you can tell in one interactive a story that is about something personal to you and about something national or international. Think about how hard that is to do in a text story, right? We've seen a lot of bad stories from journalists parachuting into these tiny communities and trying to localize a trend to a small community and then reflect back nationally. And unless you're a member of that community or familiar with that community, it just becomes a stand-in and a stereotype, right? And so there are so many examples of how you can do this near-far storytelling. This is a bike sharing service in New York. This shows what it looks like after the bike sharing was fixed. When it wasn't fixed, it was all red, which told the story of how bad bike sharing, like all of the systems were down. But this app also allows you to zoom in and see how many bikes are in the location you're going to or where you're coming from, right? Which is really helpful. It's telling two stories at once, one that is explicitly personal, right? So the another key value is this idea of openness. We talked about this before, but I think it's interesting to see it in their own words, right? So it's not journalistic to be sharing things, but we share source, and they're not sharing angles, right? But it's a resistance to the idea of secrecy and competition, right? And at the New York Times, they're building a really awesome analytics tool that will make a case for advertising investments that should challenge just click-driven advertising. I'm like, you guys should sell this tool. And they're like, oh no, that hurts our competitive advantage. I'm like, really? Right? Like, you've built this really great tool, share it, because it would help a lot of people, and don't be competitive, right? And that's a really pervasive problem in news innovation, right? These are the GitHub pages that I talked about, right? Showing your code. GitHub is basically just Facebook for people who code, right? And it's something called social open source. But in all of this, right, all of these good things that are changing the newsroom, something latent that doesn't get talked about is who comes in with this way of thinking, who comes in with these skills. And there are lots of structural factors that make it difficult for women in technology. I direct you to the Uber story that's been breaking if you have any questions about this. But I wrote this piece, and I wrote this book, and then in the methodology section, I devote a little tiny bit to gender because I didn't explicitly set out to study gender, and I thought that reflecting on it too much would distract a little bit from the book. I might think about that differently now. But my critique that I got from one of the leading figures in this movement was, well, this isn't a problem because there are two women, one who heads up the Upshot and one who heads up the Washington Post. And I'm like, and it's represented too. And Nightcar is great. You know, this is doing code in a newsroom is one of the best places for women. But the gender breakdown, even at a very self-conscious organization in terms of just speakers, is I just went through and looked at bios of speakers and looked at pictures and gender. Like, this is like a real misrepresentation, right? This is not good. And so we're talking about all of these great ideas flowing in, but there is a difficult implicit sort of conversation that needs to happen about if we bring all of this stuff in, how do the gender dynamics of a newsroom change and what implications does that ultimately have? So, where do we go from here, right? And I think my answer to this, at least, is combining the limitations with the cultural innovations that I just talked about. So not getting too carried away with the master narrative to not have a real conversation about the limitations, but to take the new ways of thinking into the newsroom a little bit more realistically, right? And so I have kind of 5 takeaways, but I think the most important might be to ask for help when necessary, and then trust cannot be taken for granted, right? And it must be earned over and over. And now I see a typo, which, anyway. So, so I think that's kind of where I land on all of this. I think that there's, and I think one of the lessons too is that transparency also requires context. So, and so does collaboration. So you can't just give a document dump of WikiLeaks emails because then you get Pizzagate, right? So you need to be transparent, but you also need to provide guidance. And that's something that journalists still have a real hold on, right? So I think, and hopefully, this complicates your understanding a little bit about some of these really exciting things that, especially in journalism schools, get held up as, you know, a real ideal opportunity or a real way of taking yourself and giving yourself an advantage, and maybe troubles that a little bit. So thank you guys for the chance to talk to you, and I'd love to take some questions. So.
We have some time for questions, yes.
Hi, my name is Dan Morrison. I teach at the J School, so, and I'm a political junkie, so I want to ask you a couple of things.
Mm-hmm.
So, Snowfall, first of all, let me just state categorically, I'm in awe of Andrew David Gall. We're incredibly lucky to have you. But when Snowfall, I remember when Snowfall came out, everybody was like, oh my God, this is the future of journalism. Like, do you know how much money they spend on that and how many people they devoted to that project? And in a time when they're shutting down all the foreign bureaus because there's no more financial resources to support that kind of work, we're not all going to do Snowfall, I assure you. Because it was millions of dollars. It was, what, 18 people who devoted over a year to one project, which was an astonishing project. And And I'll give him credit for like, it was astonishing. But if you think we're gonna do a lot of that, no, we're not in this era of lack of funds, right? Yes?
So that gets to a much larger question about the solidification and power of national elite press to the disadvantage of local news organizations. And I think there's really, Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times, recently said that it's a real problem that the centers of storytelling are now in big cities when the attention we need to be paying to are all of these other places that used to tell their own stories. There's a real problem with a New Yorker coming in, even to California. If you read the New York Times California coverage as somebody who lived in California, you're like, but there's a couple of ways to think about what technical solutions can you have, right? So one is, do you need to do a snowfall? Two, Aaron Pilhofer responded to this question at something I was at recently, where if you can devote just 2 people to thinking about this kind of stuff part-time, you can actually amplify your journalism to a degree unexpected. And I think the rise of pre-built tools will do a lot for people. But I also think that if journalism students come away with just the ability to just take somebody's code and put in just like a few lines of their own to personalize it, if you can get comfortable with that, right, just looking at a GitHub page and being like, okay, this was unique to what they did, I just need to sub in my headline here, right? That's a facility that you now have because you can stand on the shoulders of giants. So yes, but no.
Okay, and if I may, to your larger point, so, because I was one of the people who followed Nikki Silver religious, I'm one of those people who don't refresh before I go to sleep. But the issue there, it seems to me, and I haven't read your book, but it seems to me it's like when you look at the graphic, here's the breakdown of the states, here's who's red, here's who's blue. Okay, well that's part of it, but Nate Silver was very good about saying, hang on, be careful. And he would go way deep. So you just ask how many people here, how many students have taken statistics, and there was, I think, one hand. Well, how many people in the reading audience of a website have taken statistics? 0. So, what does this data mean? When you say she has an 80% chance of winning, what does that mean? It means like, he can still win, which he did, and also his model and his poll of polls and all that other sort of thing. What was really being represented there? She won 3 million votes in the popular vote. So, hey, guess what? Within the margin of error, what he predicted, he wasn't saying the Electoral College is going to do this. He said she will probably win, which she did if you look at it from one perspective. But sort of in his defense, it's like, well, if you got deep into that stuff, where he would say, be careful with how you interpret this data.
Yeah, so I think I was hoping that point came out a little bit because I was trying to sort of talk about how he wasn't actually all that wrong, and he was very aware of his limitations, and that's why it wasn't a Dewey versus Truman moment, really, because we knew about the problems with the data, right? The Dewey moment was that they had collected all of this information about voting patterns from literary digest readers, right, who were not representative of the public, right? So I think that my real issue is that complexity that you have to get through, it really A, takes time, B, takes understanding, whereas if you're presented with the interactive visualization, it makes it look simpler than it is.
But I teach photojournalism, and isn't that one of the problems with, not the problem, but isn't that one of the limitations of data journalism? You see that graphic, boom, there's the United States, here's all the red, here's all the blue, we're done. It's like, well, hell no. If you go down, and if you read Nate Silver deeply, you realize that didn't tell me what I thought it said when I looked at it.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Carl Bybee over in Media Studies in the J School. And I think what you've presented here is really this kind of wonderful demystification of kind of big data journalism, maybe a kind of a demystification and a more kind of thoughtful cultural contextualization of it. But for me, in some ways, another question, maybe even for me, a more interesting question is, you're demystifying a problem that we now have, but it's like, why did we get this problem? I mean, what were the forces in play that drove us to believe that I mean, who needed us to believe that big journalism was going to save journalism? And how has that played out? And how do the kinds of solutions you're offering here kind of address that dynamic?
Again, really big question.
Yeah.
So I think that offering a political economy critique showing the sort of, these are very reactionary, not all decisions are made fearfully in newsrooms, but I think if you go and read any news industry blog, there's a lot of, oh my gosh, journalism is dying, oh my gosh, we have faced an existential threat, even among sort of some of the bright and shining stars, it's still a scary time, and I think that fear is really palpable. So if there's something to hinge on, and you saw it with interactive journalism, now you're seeing it with VR, right? There's always some new and shiny thing that's going to save journalism, where in reality, what does saving even mean, right? And so I think that's really the goal here. I think I should say is that where I am now is not where I was in the book. And I think that hopefully you will buy and read the book, and then this will kind of give you sort of a where I am now.
Time for a few more questions.
Oh, also, thank you for using the word demystifying. I feel like,
Perfectly suited for the lecture series.
yes.
Okay, I have nothing to do with journalism and background in social sciences. And my question is, you talk about statistics, about this quantitative approach to journalism. Could that be the lack of this kind of thinking or the method, so-called scientific method approach to journalism, is based on the philosophy behind, the general, the journalism in general? Like, let's say, for example, because the philosophy, at least I read a book somewhere saying that if a dog bites a man, it's not news. If a man bites a dog, it's news. So if the people's thinking news is based on this uniqueness rather than so-called, quantify this based on the probability, then of course, they are like this kind of probably teaching a curriculum in the in the education system, and also in general people approach, how journalists approach to a news, correct? Could that be because the dominant philosophy does not emphasize?
So I think you're addressing kind of what's happening as a divergence. I think that in this concern about authority, you saw a real turn towards data-driven storytelling. That's a trend that actually starts in journalism in the 60s and 70s and even into the 50s about using computation to make journalism more social scientific. I think what you see, and actually Michael Shudson and Kate Fink have written about this, Kevin Barnhurst, is that actually some journalism is becoming really close to sociology. Like some of what you read is, extensive interviewing, extensive data analysis. These could be master's theses, right? They are at that level. On the other hand, if you look at what's happening in a lot of metropolitan news outlets, and I just published a paper on this, you see this real devaluing of the unique properties of what news can do. And so you see, right, this man bites dog stuff, definitely a real critique of, the shiny newness. But this is, instead of getting that awesome sociological reporting, what you get in a lot of local news is boat fire, or garage got crashed into, or pit bulls on the loose. And that, I think, is a real difficulty and a real divergence and discussion about resources that needs to happen. A student asked me something.
We have lots of students in the room. So
Hopefully, yeah.
So if I was to sign up for a class to help this next term, what is the class you would recommend?
I think, so the problem is that sort of you need to get two steps. Because if you want to work with data, I think it's really hard to do data visualization without knowing something about data. So you kind of have to take a data class to get to a data visualization class. But if you're talking about immersion journalism and multimedia storytelling, I think you're already doing a lot of that. The question is, how do you sort of take advantages of programming knowledge to make that more interactive? Because right now a lot of those stories are pretty flat, right? So there's a lot of cool stuff, like Vice is doing this. I don't know if you guys watch Vice News, but if you're watching on your computer and then they're like, for more, click here, right? That's straight up video journalism with amplification through digital storytelling. That can't be that hard to add, right? This is just an annotation feature on YouTube where you can annotate something with a link, right? So this is not sophisticated programming. It's just a thinking about how do we take multimedia storytelling and then add on a layer of interactivity. And I don't think it's that hard, right? I just talked to you about how YouTube, right? If you know something about YouTube, you could annotate a video, right?
I'm not a student. Well, I am a student, actually, that's why I came. But it seems to me, I'm surprised that you didn't suggest to the student who asked this question about a class that you wouldn't say, even before you take the data class, you need to take a philosophy of science class. Because it seems to me like one of the main points you're making in this presentation about recontextualizing our understanding of data journalism is inviting us to think about the work that gets done when we choose what we're going to measure and what we're not going to measure and how we're going to measure it. That these are not value-free orientations, but in fact, it's all editorial and it's all value-driven all the way through.
Well, I mean, somebody was telling me, I think Damien was saying that, you only take 60 credits in this department, which has advantages and disadvantages, but you're getting a liberal arts education, right? And there are some really good things that the university can do to encourage people to just take a basic statistics class, right? And a statistics class taught for non-majors should give you that critique, but you're not just taking skills classes here, right? You're taking classes that Dr. Lewis is providing and then some of the critical cultural faculty that as a journalism student, you are being challenged to think theoretically. And so I think you guys are in a really good place because you've got such a blended faculty, and you should feel really good about that, right? A lot of journalism schools are you just go on a program with straight skills, and then, hey, that editing technology you learned doesn't exist anymore by the time you, right? So I think you guys are lucky, right? I want to take your question, but I really want to get a student. Another student, you guys are all here. I really want to hear what you guys have to say because this is what your future is.
Yeah, I want to know a little bit more. We talked a bit about, this sort of like elite coastal journalism ideas and, the death or, falling of small local papers. But I'm wondering, obviously we're talking a lot about trust in journalism and the rise of fake news and how we can rebuild trust. And I think, as sort of the main point of this, like there is this mystification around who do this sort of journalism and this sort of work because the everyday person doesn't understand what goes on putting it together. So how can sort of we build trust through this sort of journalism when, the everyday person looking at it doesn't understand how it was put together?
So I think one of the biggest changes you're seeing, so we do know, and this needs to be asked in a more nuanced way, but if you ask Tom Rosenstiel at API or some of the folks at Pew, local news tracks differently in the trust situation. It's getting worse because there are fewer people who live next to a reporter, right? Or fewer people who know an editor who's on the school board or something like that. So as local news depletes, you start to lose that personal connection. But I think people forget in these, people don't trust the media. There's a bad question, because do you trust the media? You're putting in that net, right? But it doesn't distinguish between local and national, and I think people do tend to trust local media a lot more. And part of that is just the familiarity with the faces in the community and the high school sports coverage, right? It's a different relationship that you have. On the other hand, I think there are so many ways to tell stories that are more transparent. I don't think this is about engaged journalism. I think that this is about showing how the work gets done. That's part of what Dr. Lewis and I have been doing with a lot of our work is trying to, tell people how journalists do their work, right? Because most people have never stepped foot into a newsroom, right? And I make the argument that sometimes that news decision making is pretty algorithmic in the sense that it's a black box. You don't know what's being talked about in your local news organization. Sometimes you'll get a live stream, very rarely. But how those news decisions are made day to day on a daily basis are just as unclear as what's going into the Facebook algorithm. So it doesn't have to be that way, right?
Well, on that point, we'll end. Thank you very much, Dr. Usher. Thank you.